Welcome to the deep dive. We're about to really plunge into some foundational thinking today, digging into military strategy.
Yeah, really foundational stuff.
Our source material.
Yeah.
It's excerpts from Baron Antoine-Henri de Jomini's classic, The Art of War, specifically the restored edition of his summary.
And this is, Jomini's big attempt to capture the essence of Napoleonic warfare, what made it tick, and sort of distill it into principles, almost like a science. He was there, saw it firsthand.
He really was. And this edition we're looking at, it even has this slightly humorous footnote.
Oh, yeah.
Suggesting the ebook might get a bit hostile and unpleasant around anything written by Clausewitz.
Ah, gives you a feel for that, well, perceived rivalry anyway. Two giants of military thought.
It definitely sets it down.
Right.
So our mission for this deep dive, we're going to explore everything Jomini lays out in these sources. No skimming.
We're going deep.
We want to pull out the core concepts, the maybe surprising bits, and really give you a shortcut to understanding his whole framework. By the end, you should have a solid grasp of the key ideas in these excerpts, what he thought was timeless, and how he tried to, well, build that science out of the chaos of war.
Think of it like cutting through the density, finding those fundamental principles he believed in.
Okay, let's start unpacking. First up, who exactly was Jomini, and what was he trying to do with this book? The introduction gives us some context.
Right. Jomini had a pretty unique perspective. He'd held staff positions, worked directly with Napoleon with his marshals, so he got both the ground-level view and the high-level strategic planning.
And he famously switched sides, didn't he? From French to Russian service.
He did. The sources mention that, and also Napoleon's sort of surprisingly forgiving take on it later. Apparently, Napoleon figured, well, Jomini was Swiss and didn't give away any really big secrets.
Interesting. So that move, plus Napoleon's fall, kind of led him into semi-retirement and writing.
Pretty much. And the big work we're focused on is the Summary of the Art of War. Came out in 1830, then an updated version in 1838.
And the source points out that update was after Clausewitz's On War was published by his wife.
Notable timing. And Jomini's book was a huge hit, basically instantly. Adopted by top military schools, West Point, St. Cyr, it became the textbook for a while.
It was really the first big attempt to analyze Napoleon's methods by someone who'd actually been inside that system.
But, the source also notes a kind of irony. He tried to take what he saw as simple strategic ideas and build this complex science around them, which ended up making his own book kind of dense and hard to summarize.
He defends that, though, right? He actually calls his mania for definitions a merit.
He does. He argued he needed to define terms clearly because he felt he was laying the groundwork for a new science of war. He needed a specific language, a nomenclature for these military concepts.
He seems pretty open about it, saying he'd accept better definitions if someone offered them.
Shows a certain, intellectual honesty. He also explained why he kept using Napoleonic examples over and over.
Why was that?
He figured his readers, officers, statesmen would know that recent history. Using familiar campaigns like Austerlitz or Jena made his points clearer, more accessible, rather than digging up obscure battles from centuries ago. It was for convenience and intelligibility.
So the main goal was finding the veritable rules of war, establishing that scientific basis.
Right.
And he explicitly aimed it at instructing princes, statesmen, not just generals.
Exactly. Leaders needed to understand this stuff. And he makes a really crucial distinction early on between knowledge and skill.
Ah, yes, you need both for success.
Right. Knowledge isn't just knowing a ton of facts, it's knowing what's relevant to your specific mission. But then there's skill, that innate ability, the quick thinking, the coup d'oeil. Jomini admits no book can teach that.
He saw people with theory who couldn't apply it.
Exactly. Marshals even, who knew the ideas but couldn't execute them under pressure. His book was for those with the potential, the germ, to help them develop it.
And he wasn't writing in a vacuum, was he? The sources mention a whole bunch of other military writers.
Loads of them. Fouquiers, Foulard, Puysegur, Bülow, Lloyd, Archduke Charles, Wellington. German writers, French, English, Clausewitz, of course. It shows this was a lively field of debate he was stepping into.
He was positioning his work within that ongoing conversation.
Definitely. And his overall definition of the art of war, you kind of piece it together from the book's structure, is that vital link between the political goals, the initial planning, and then the actual movement of armies on the map, the whole chain.
Which leads us perfectly into Chapter 1, statesmanship and its relation to war. That connection feels incredibly modern, doesn't it? Politics and military action aren't separate.
Fundamental for Jomini. He starts right off categorizing wars based on their political aims. Are you trying to reclaim rights? Is it politically defensive but militarily offensive? Just a war of expediency.
He gets into wars with allies, too. Sounds tricky.
Oh, he saw them as inherently complex. His big point is that success with allies demands political wisdom. The general has to be a bit of a statesman, too. You absolutely need clear agreements beforehand. Who's doing what? Especially for the main thrust. What's the common objective, driven by shared interest?
If you don't have that,
That's why coalitions often failed, he argued. They neglected those things, fragmented their efforts, and got picked off by a more unified enemy, like Napoleon often did.
what about intervention wars?
He breaks those down, too. Are you just sending an auxiliary force agreed by treaty? Are you propping up a weaker neighbor? Or are you jumping in as a major player yourself?
He uses Austria in 1813 as a key example, right?
Absolutely. Their intervention was decisive. Why? They had a massive army, sure, but crucially, they entered the war positioned to hit Napoleon's main front in reverse. That combination, military weight plus strategic position, driven by political timing, gave them, as Jomini puts it, almost perfect certainty of success. It wasn't just numbers, it was where they entered the game.
He also talks about aggressive wars for conquest. What's the distinction he makes there?
It depends on where you're invading. If it's somewhere like Italy or Austria or Prussia, where you don't necessarily fear the inhabitants rising up en masse, then the standard principles of strategy pretty much dictate your course.
But distant invasions are different.
Totally different game. Think Napoleon in Russia. Success there depends much more on diplomacy. You need to secure a sincere, truly devoted ally nearby. Someone who can provide a safe base, depots, a refuge if things go wrong, someone whose interests align with yours. Strategy alone can't guarantee success when you're that far from home and relying on local factors. Article X Unites is referenced here regarding invasions.
Then he gets into the really messy stuff. Wars of opinion, national wars, civil wars.
Yeah, these are different beasts entirely. He calls them deplorable. Terrible. Why? Because they ignite the worst human passions. They become personal, vindictive, cruel, almost tribal.
The French Revolution is his big case study here.
For wars of opinion and national wars, yes, the sheer intensity of it. He actually debates the 1793 campaign against France. Could the Allies have won?
What was his take?
He thought their military leadership was poor. They got bogged down, besieging fortresses when, he argues, maybe they should have just marched straight for Paris.
Risky, though.
Hugely risky. He admits it's a what-if. We don't know how the French nation or army would have reacted, but he presents it as the potentially decisive alternative path they missed because they focused on secondary objectives, the fortresses, instead of the political center. It was one of two equally grave solutions, he says.
And for national wars, like Spain against Napoleon, where the whole population resists, what's the approach?
You need overwhelming force, first off. Then patience. You have to try and calm popular passions, exhaust them over time, and crucially, a mix of approaches. Courtesy, gentleness, but also severity when needed, but always act justly. Discipline is paramount.
He points to some examples of success.
Yeah, people like Hoche in La Vendée, Suchet in parts of Spain. They showed that good discipline and fair treatment could be more effective in the long run than just brute force in pacifying a hostile population. Dibich and Paskovich in the recent Russo-Turkish War are also cited for discipline.
He also mentions civil wars, especially when mixed with foreign intervention.
Calls them frightful. France during the Leeds times is his historical lesson. He basically says giving maxims for these is absurd, but offers one rule. Try to unite the factions against the foreign intervener first, then sort out internal claims. Any third power intervening is probably just ambitious.
And a warning against double wars fighting two major conflicts at once.
Right. That's mentioned in the table of contents as a major danger. Divides your resources, your focus. Generally a bad idea, according to Jomini.
So the big takeaway from this chapter seems to be the basic principles of war always apply, but how you apply them has to change radically depending on the political goals and the nature of the war itself.
Exactly. You wouldn't handle a popular uprising in Spain the same way you'd plan a campaign against the Austrian army heading for Vienna. The core strategic ideas are there, but the commander needs discretion, judgment, based on the specific circumstances. A regiment fights similarly everywhere, but the general's plan must adapt.
That idea of adapting leads nicely into Article XV on the military spirit of nations and the morale of armies. How important is this sort of softer side of war for Jomini?
Hugely important. He sees armies not just as machines, but as living things, susceptible to spirit. And what motivates them varies by national character.
How do you influence that spirit?
Military eloquence is one tool he mentions. Proclamations, speeches. He cites Napoleon, obviously, but also others like Pascovitch, Suwarov, even the Spanish juntas using rhetoric effectively, or invoking miracles like the Madonna del Pilar.
What else builds morale, besides speeches?
Two big things: a cherished cause the soldiers believe in, and a general who inspires confidence, usually through a track record of success.
He makes a distinction between enthusiasm and military spirit, right?
Yeah, a key one. Enthusiasm driven by politics, religion, patriotism is powerful but often temporary. Great for a single burst of action, but hard to sustain. If the troops get discouraged, it can collapse quickly and lead to disorder.
And military spirit.
That's more permanent, more stable. It comes from good military institutions, skilled commanders, good training, discipline. It's less dependent on the immediate cause or circumstances, and it's something the government should actively cultivate. Imperturbable coolness in battle, linked to this spirit, allows for steadier action.
How does a state cultivate that spirit, not just in the army, but in the whole nation?
By giving the military social standing and public consideration, he suggests preferring those with state service, especially military, for administrative jobs, maybe even requiring military service for certain offices.
He contrasts that with some ideas of his time.
Yeah, he favorably compares ancient Rome, or contemporary Russia and Prussia, with modern theorists who wanted a strict separation between military officers and public administration roles. He thought that was foolish, rejecting the idea that only rhetoricians, as he puts it, should run things.
But spirit among the people isn't enough on its own.
Nope. You need military virtues within the army itself. You can have a large population fired up, but if the army lacks training, discipline, and valor, it's still ineffective. Courage needs to be systematically recompensed and honored.
He also talks about readiness for war, doesn't he, on page 26?
Yes, a really important point for him. Civilized governments, he argues, should always be ready to wage war quickly, never be caught unprepared. This isn't about maintaining a massive standing army constantly on a war footing. He calls that a scourge and says it's not practical everywhere.
So what does readiness mean then?
It means having wise institutions, administrative foresight, a sound military policy, things like well-organized reserves, good systems for mobilization, efficient supply chains, so you can ramp up quickly when needed.
He even links government structure to military effectiveness on page 28.
He does. He argues, maybe controversially, that governments controlled by elective assemblies, despite their other advantages, tend to be politically and militarily weaker, less decisive than pure monarchies.
Why?
He felt they struggled with rapid, unified action, especially in crises. He saw dictatorial power concentrated in a few hands as a potential plank of safety in emergencies, citing the French Convention after Robespierre finally showing energy only when it essentially became dictatorial.
Interesting perspective from his time. He also touches briefly on armament, page 31.
Right. He acknowledges that technology matters. Improvements in infantry or cavalry arms could revolutionize tactics and organization. The state that leads in this will gain advantages. Artillery, he felt, was already quite advanced.
But then he makes that famous statement.
The core Jominian belief. Despite technological change, the fundamental principles of strategy remain unchanged. The way Scipio, Caesar, Frederick, Napoleon applied mass against fractions at decisive points, those truths hold, independent of the specific weapons or army structure. A hugely influential and debated idea.
And connecting back to statesmanship, he brings up the choice of commander again in the supplement, referencing Article 14. This seems critical for him.
Absolutely vital. It's part of military policy that statesmen must understand. If the sovereign isn't leading the army personally, choosing the right general is the single most important decision.
What qualities should they look for?
Someone with tried qualities, proven ability, high character, and energy. And you need a good strategist as chief of staff. Ideally, you find a great captain who combines command and strategic genius. If not, pair a talented commander with a skilled chief of staff. He warns against rulers interfering foolishly or letting a general pick a weak, compliant chief of staff just to maintain control. The nation's safety hangs on getting this right.
Okay, all that groundwork, the political context, the national spirit, the leadership sets the stage for the main event. Chapter 3, Strategy.
This is really the heart of Jomini's system, where he lays out the science. He defines strategy explicitly on page 44. It's the art of directing armies on the decisive points of the theater of war, or of the zone of operations. It connects that high-level political direction with the actual movement of armies on the map to achieve the war's objective. Grand planning.
And his most famous contribution, the fundamental principle of war.
Yes. Stated a couple of ways, page 44, page 47. The core idea is always, apply the mass of your forces to the decisive point.
How does he phrase it on page 47?
First, to obtain by free and rapid movements the advantage of bringing the mass of the troops against fractions of the enemy. The second, to strike in the most decisive direction. That's the engine driving successful campaigns as he saw it. Concentrate your strength against enemy weakness at the most critical spot.
Let's break down the terminology he uses to build this strategic framework. He starts with system of operations, theater of operations, basis, Articles 1678.
Right. The system of operations is just the overall plan or course you adopt for the campaign.
Theater of operations.
That's the whole vast area where the conflict could potentially play out. It includes your territory, your allies' territory, maybe weaker states caught in the middle. It's the macro view. Don't confuse it with the theater for a single army's campaign, which is smaller. He gives examples like a war between France and Austria might be limited to Italy, or it might span Italy and Germany, changing the theater.
And basis of operations, Article 8.
These are your secure starting points. Your frontiers, major fortresses, ports if you're a naval power, there where you get supplies, where you can safely retreat, where you build up strength, your anchor.
Does the shape of the base matter?
Absolutely. He points out the advantages of a base with, say, two faces, or one that's perpendicular to the enemy's likely line of advance. Like using the Rhine and Main rivers in 1806 allowed Napoleon to easily intercept the Prussians moving towards the Main. Gives you flexibility, lets you potentially change your strategic front more easily. An insular power relies on coastal bases, assuming sea control.
Okay, next. Strategic lines and points and decisive points.
Yeah.
Article 9Es. This sounds crucial.
It is. Strategic lines are basically your lines of movement and communication, roads, rivers, canals, your operational network.
And decisive points.
These are the points where applying your mass will have the greatest effect. Jomini identify several kinds.
Like what?
Geographic ones, points that are always important due to the landscape, a key mountain pass, a major river crossing, a valley like the Danube that acts as a strategic corridor.
And others.
Points relating to the army's positions and maneuvers. Fortified towns on the frontier, river crossings the enemy needs, key road junctions, supply depots, and especially the enemy's capital city, often vital for political and military reasons.
He also mentions temporary decisive points.
Yes, points that become critical because of the current situation. Maybe the enemy armies is split, the decisive point becomes the spot where you can hit one fraction before the other arrives. But the most decisive points, he consistently emphasizes, are the flank of the enemy army, and especially their line of operations, their communication line back to their base.
Why is hitting the line of operations so key?
Because if you cut it successfully, you isolate them, trap them. They can't get supplies, reinforcements, or retreat easily. It offers the biggest potential payoff.
So the maxim is?
Apply your largest possible force against these decisive points. And don't try to hit multiple decisive points at once unless you have overwhelming numbers. Concentrate your effort where it counts most. Offensively, you target them. Defensively, you protect them or aim to retake them.
Got it. Next concept, strategic front, Article XX.
This is simply the front or the line that your army occupies as it faces the enemy within the theater of operations.
And the key maneuver here is changing the strategic front.
Yes. This is a major move where you shift your army's position so it becomes perpendicular to your original base or to the enemy's line of advance. Why do it? The main goal is usually to seize the enemy's communications, to get onto their flank or rear.
Like Napoleon in 1806.
Exactly. His move from the main river towards Gera and Naumburg effectively turned the Prussian flank and put him on their line of retreat before the main battle at Jena-Auerstedt. Moreau's move in 1800 to force Kray out of Ulm is another example he uses. It's powerful, turning the strategic tables, but it can also be risky if miscalculated.
What about double strategic front?
Sometimes terrain forces it on you, like fighting in a country with a major mountain range or river dividing the theater. He mentions Turkey and Spain. Or you might need to adopt one offensively if you have to protect a long flank while advancing. It generally means dividing your forces, which Jomini dislikes unless necessary.
Strategic positions, Article XE1. How are these different?
These are more temporary positions occupied by parts of the Army Corps. Large detachments either on your main front or guarding flanks, covering a siege, observing a sector. They're components of your overall strategic posture. Think of detachments covering multiple routes or observation points.
He also mentions a strategic line of defense needing a rally point.
Right. If you're defending a long line like a riverbank, you can't be strong everywhere. So you need a designated tactical point behind the center or somewhere advantageous where your forces can concentrate quickly if the enemy breaks through somewhere along the line. You plan for penetration and how to counter-concentrate.
This all leads to the choice of lines of operations in Article XE2. This seems like where the planning hits the road.
It absolutely is. The line of operations is the actual path or direction your army takes to reach its objective point. Choosing the right line is critical. It should offer the best chances of success with the least danger, always guided by that fundamental principle.
What are the key maxims here based on page 83?
Okay, several important ones. First, attacking the enemy's communications, their line of operations usually yields the greatest results.
Single versus multiple lines.
Generally, operate on a single main line unless you have vastly superior forces or very specific circumstances, like two separate enemy groups. Double lines divide your forces, violating the principle of mass.
Interior versus exterior lines.
Interior lines are superior. Operating from a central position against enemies on the outside allows you to concentrate against their separated parts, defeating them in detail.
Converging versus diverging lines.
Converging lines directed into the enemy's territory are good for hitting their fractions. Diverging lines from your own central position are advantageous if the enemy is already widely dispersed. But the classic is using interior lines against converging or exterior enemy lines.
Like Napoleon in 96 or 1814.
Perfect examples. Rapid movement between separated Austrian forces in Italy or against the scattered Allied armies invading France. That's the power of interior lines Jomini championed. He also notes that a line perpendicular to the enemy's base is often best for cutting them off. Choosing the wrong line, even if you have numbers, can lose you all advantages.
Supply matters for the line too, right?
Definitely. Lines through rich, fertile country are much better for an attacker. Supplies are easier. Movement is less constrained. Compare the French campaigns in Swabia or Lombardy with their struggles in barren Poland in 1806 or Lithuania in 1812, where logistics became a nightmare.
He pushes back against a rigid rule about clearing flanks, doesn't he?
He does. Some theorists argued you had to secure the country on both sides of your line of operations for a distance equal to its depth to guarantee your retreat. Jomini says this is often impractical, would paralyze movement, and history shows it's not always necessary.
So what's his take?
You need to prevent sizable enemy forces from threatening your flanks or rear, yes, but you can't sweep every village clean. It depends on the terrain, rivers, enemy capabilities, morale, the commander's skills, practical judgment over geometric dogma. Moreau advancing on Vienna in 1800, Napoleon moving on Piacenza in the same year. They didn't strictly follow that rule, but succeeded.
He used Napoleon in Italy, 1796, again, as a prime example of strategic combinations.
Especially that pursuit of Wurmser. Wurmser tries to cut Napoleon's communications by moving down the Brenta Valley. Napoleon has choices. Stay on the Adige, risky, retreat, or follow Wurmser down the Brenta.
Which he did.
Yeah. Jomini calls it sublime but rash. A bold, rapid maneuver, Trent to Bassano in days. It led to victory at Bassano, cut off part of Wurmser's force, and regained Napoleon's own communications. The difficult terrain actually offered some refuge if he'd been beaten. Jomini contrasts this audacity, enabled partly by the ground, with Blücher's risky move towards Wavre in 1815, also bold, but over different terrain.
He doesn't shy away from Napoleon's mistakes either, like in 1813.
No, he's critical. Failing to pursue the Allies vigorously into Bohemia after the victory at Dresden, a mischance, Jomini thought, to potentially shatter the coalition, which led directly to the disaster at Culm where Vandamme was trapped.
Other mistakes in 1813.
Fighting decisive battles like Katzbach when Napoleon wasn't present with the main mass of his forces. MacDonald, the commander there, apparently disobeyed instructions, leading to defeat. Jomini felt the overall 1813 plan could have worked if executed properly, sticking to the principle of concentration, but failures in execution, follow-through, and sometimes staff work undermined it.
Protecting a line of operations when deep in enemy territory. Article 23. How do you do that? Temporary bases or strategic reserves?
Right. When you're far from your main frontier bases, you need intermediate points. These could be fortified river crossings, tête de pont, captured towns secured for depots and hospitals. But Jomini cautions they're rarely as secure as your permanent bases.
Why not?
Because if the enemy still has significant forces nearby that can threaten your real line of communication back home, then that temporary base is just a point of support, not a truly secure new base.
He uses the Elbe line in 1813 as an example again.
Yes. Napoleon used the Elbe River with fortified towns like Dresden and Hamburg. It could have been a solid base if Austria remained neutral. But once Austria joined the Allies on his flank and rear, The Elbe line became just a pivot, and holding it long-term became dangerous because it could be turned, enveloped, which is what happened, leading to Leipzig.
What about strategic reserves?
These are large bodies of troops held back, not on the main front line, ready to move where needed, reinforce a point, counter a threat, exploit a success. Jomini calls this a purely modern invention, Napoleonic era, and notes it has both advantages and disadvantages, though the excerpt doesn't detail them fully. They can help cover deficiencies if you lack good temporary bases.
He sees Napoleon's 1800 campaign, culminating at Marengo, as a real turning point in strategy.
A new era. Bold objectives aiming to capture or destroy entire enemy armies, not just occupy territory or cities. Armies organized into larger, more flexible corps, 2 or 3 divisions each. Rapid marches, decisive battles. Modern strategy fully developed, he argues, with 1805 Austerlitz and 1806 Jena as direct consequences or corollaries. Tactics also adapted, like using columns and skirmishers effectively in Italy.
And the impact of these rapid operations, living off the land via bivouacs, page 103.
He has mixed feelings. On one hand, it enlarges the art of war, allows for greater speed and reach. On the other, he calls it bad for humanity, comparing it to barbarian hordes devastating the land. But he admits it's unlikely to be abandoned.
What did it demonstrate strategically?
That simple remoteness is no longer a guarantee against invasion. Security now depends on good fortresses, strong lines of defense, well-organized reserves, including militia supporting active armies, good military institutions, and effective government. Larger armies necessitate rapid operations to achieve results quickly before supplies run out or coalitions form.
Fortifications also play a big role in Jomini's strategy, right? Page 110 onwards.
Definitely. Both field works, entrenched camps, lines, and permanent fortifications. Fortresses, forts. They aren't just passive defenses, they actively support strategic operations. Fortified frontiers are inherently stronger. A series of fortresses along a key strategic line has offensive and defensive value, secure bases for launching attacks, obstacles for the enemy. Large rivers used as strategic lines need fortified bridgeheads, tête de pont. When advancing, securing your line of retreat often means reducing a key fortress on a river. They provide refuge, depots, strong points, points d'appui, check enemy advances, cover the country. Crucially, they should be located on strategic points, not just anywhere.
He gives some maxims on page 113.
Yeah, summarizing the value. Need large fortresses as main anchors on each frontier, plus smaller forts and posts to facilitate field army operations. Even walled cities in the interior are useful as depots, hospitals, rally points for militia. Mountain passes need small forts, like Fort Bard in 1800.
What about entrenched camps and lines, page 116?
These are field fortifications. Strategically, they should be located on major decisive points. They can serve as departure points for offense, secure river crossings, provide refuge, or cover winter quarters.
But there are risks.
Big risks. It's hard to build one that can't be turned or bypassed, unless it's on terrain like a peninsula, he mentions Torres Vedras. If the enemy gets around it, the army inside risks being invested and trapped. He uses the Dresden camp in 1813 as a negative example. Napoleon left 2 corps there. They got surrounded and had to surrender after Leipzig, a huge loss.
He disagrees with some German generals' views on them.
Yes, some argued their main use was to cover fortified places and prevent sieges. Jomini thinks that's sophistical. He believes forts and camps should support each other, but the main use of a camp is as a temporary refuge or an offensive launch pad.
What's the folly, then?
Burying your main field army inside an entrenched camp just to try and slow down a siege of a nearby fortress. He uses Wurmser at Mantua in 1796. Wurmser retreated into Mantua with his army. The army perished from disease and starvation, and the fortress still fell eventually. Jomini questions if the sacrifice was worth it. Wurmser's presence actually hastened the fortress's fall by consuming supplies faster.
How does terrain like mountains influence strategy? Page 122.
It depends. If mountains are just a feature within a broader zone of operations, they're often treated like secondary obstacles, maybe observed by detachments while the main action happens in the valleys. Archduke Charles, Jomini notes, believed controlling the main valleys, like the Danube for southern Germany, was key.
But if the whole theater is mountainous,
Then it's very different. Strategic maneuvers become much harder due to terrain, limited roads, difficulty concentrating forces. But if successful, they can be even more decisive. If an attacker manages to seize a key pass or communication center in the enemy's rear, it can completely trap and ruin an army because escape routes are so few.
defense is hard too.
Very hard. You have to try and cover multiple passes and valleys. Moving troops laterally across mountain ranges to reinforce threatened points is extremely difficult and slow compared to flatter terrain.
He contrasts this with Napoleon's 1805 Ulm maneuver.
Right. Cutting off Mack was facilitated by the relatively good road network in Swabia, allowing rapid transversal marches. In truly rugged mountains without good cross routes, that kind of swift enveloping maneuver might be impossible. Conversely, Mack might have found it easier to retreat if there were more roads offering escape routes.
And remote invasions, page 126. Sounds like the ultimate challenge.
Jomini sees them as incredibly difficult, citing history maybe only 5 or 6 truly successful ones in 4,000 years, he claims. They often end ruinously for the invader.
What's the absolute key to having any chance of success?
Diplomacy trumps pure strategy here. You must secure a reliable, powerful ally near the theater of operations, someone who offers a secure base, supplies, a refuge, and can help you resume the offensive if needed.
What else?
All the usual strategic precautions from other articles, safe lines of operation, eventual bases, plus a realistic appreciation of distance, obstacles, climate, local resources, accuracy in planning, moderation in success. But purely military maxims alone cannot guarantee success in such ventures.
Okay, that covers the high-level strategy and planning. Now for Chapter 5, mixed operations, things that blend strategy and tactics.
Right, these are actions that bridge the gap. Diversions and great detachments, Article 6. Sending a part of your army off on a secondary mission.
Good or bad?
Depends entirely on judgment. Deciding when, where, and how strong a detachment to send is a delicate balancing act for the commander. Useful if it's timely, well coordinated with the main effort, and forces the enemy to weaken themselves. Dangerous if it's ill-conceived, just disperses your own strength, or gets isolated and destroyed.
Frederick the Great had a view on this.
Yeah, Jomini quotes him saying, a key skill is making your adversary detach forces, so you can either crush the detachment or attack their weakened main body. Turn dispersion against them.
Passages of rivers, Article XC7, tactical act, strategic importance.
Exactly. The physical crossing is tactical, but where you choose to cross is a major strategic decision. It determines what follows. Moreau choosing an easier crossing point on the Rhine in 1800, possibly missing a chance for a bigger strategic turning movement. Contrast that with Napoleon in the same campaign, crossing the Po at Piacenza specifically to get behind Melas, a purely strategic choice of crossing point. Or the Donau-Werthingolstadt crossings in 1805, the direction chosen led directly to Mack's army being surrounded at Ulm.
What are the challenges and methods?
Protecting your bridges is vital, often requires dividing forces temporarily. The enemy might try to hit your separated parts or seize the bridges. Jomini discusses crossing at the center of the enemy's line versus crossing at one extremity.
Central passage.
Aim to overwhelm the enemy corps right in front of you, then potentially strike outwards eccentrically against their other forces.
Extremity passage.
Cross on one flank, secure your bridges in your rear, then move along the river to roll up the enemy's front. Kind of like Frederick the Great's tactical maneuver at Lucen applied strategically. Jourdan's Rhine crossing in 1795 failed, but Jomini argues it wasn't the fault of the extremity passage itself, but other factors like the French operating on exterior lines. The commander has to pick based on the situation.
Inevitably, retreats are covered. Article Segabid.
Yeah, an army retreating is usually in a bad way, physically and morally. It's the result of defeats or significant inferiority. Jomini analyzes different types.
Which does he prefer?
A parallel retreat. If you're retiring in good order and intend to fight again soon, retreating roughly parallel to the enemy's front or flank keeps your army compact, concentrated, and ready for battle. Don't just stick to one road if parallel roads are available. This is often feasible in countries with multiple potential bases or fortified lines. He mentions Spain, Turkey, France.
What about retreating straight back along your line of operations?
That's the natural impulse, but dangerous. It's exactly the line the enemy wants to cut.
And divergent retreats.
He strongly criticizes these. Splitting your retreating army onto diverging roads just weakens you further, allows a concentrated enemy to pick off your fractions. He dismisses justifications based on covering flanks. When retreating from a superior, concentrated enemy, concentration is your only hope of survival. Don't divide.
Passages of rivers in retreat, Article 39, sounds even worse.
Extremely delicate, he calls it. Requires meticulous planning. Get your heavy baggage and parks across first. Keep the rear guard at the right distance. Have fresh troops ready to cover the bridgehead while the main body crosses. The final rear guard holds until night if possible, crosses last, then destroys the bridges.
Beresina, 1812, the ultimate example.
A remarkable, horrifying example. The French were in a desperate state. Famine, freezing cold, enemy closing in from front and rear, a marshy river to cross. They escaped partly due to a Russian general's mistake, Chichagov, but also through incredible heroism and engineering under fire. Jomini debates whether to admire the Russian plan, converging armies, or the French firmness more.
Winter quarters are also discussed briefly in Article 39 is continued.
Just noting the difficulty of organizing them stably. Much easier in areas with plenty of large towns for shelter and supply, like Lombardy, Saxony, Netherlands, than in sparsely populated regions, Poland, Russia. Logistics are key.
And finally in this chapter, descents, or amphibious landings. Article XL.
He sees them as rare and very difficult, especially against a prepared enemy, ever since gunpowder made coastal defenses more formidable. Success hinges on naval superiority. Commanding the sea during the landing is essential.
Rules for success.
Deceive the enemy about your landing point. Pick a spot sheltered from weather and enemy fire. Act with extreme speed and activity. Seize a strong point quickly to cover the force as it builds up ashore. Get artillery ashore early.
When are they easiest?
When the target country is already busy fighting a major war elsewhere and can't devote full attention to coastal defense. He runs through historical examples. Greeks at Troy, the Xerxes, Alexander coordinating army and fleet, Punic Wars, Vikings, Normans, William the Conqueror's complex 1066 operation. Then mentors the Crusades, Ottoman naval power, Muhammad II, Siege of Malta, Siege of Candia, highlighting its ferocity and cost. He notes England's sea power changed the game, mentioning the failed Franco-Spanish Armada against England in 1779. And the relatively easy capture of Veracruz in the 1862 Mexico expedition because the Mexicans offered no initial resistance.
So that covers those mixed operations. Now logistics, Chapter 6, Article 2, perhaps. The practical art of moving armies.
Yes, though the sources note Jomini himself and his translators found logistics a slightly slippery term to define precisely. But functionally, it's the how-to, the practical business of making the army move, work, and fight effectively according to the strategic plan.
The Chief of Staff is central here.
Absolutely. Jomini sees the Chief of Staff's role as critical, assisting the general in planning, clearly communicating orders and instructions down the chain, and then supervising the execution, ensuring everything works together. This requires knowledge across all branches of the art of war strategy, tactics, engineering, supply. He mentions Archduke Charles. Guibert also wrote on this. Logistics, in this broad sense, covers that practical application.
What are some specific duties of staff officers mentioned? Pages 206, 208.
A lot of preparation. Inspecting all the material before operations start: horses, wagons, harnesses, bridge trains, tools, artillery equipment, siege trains, field hospitals, ambulances, ensuring everything is ready to go.
And during movement.
Arranging the marches themselves, making sure different columns move in an orderly, connected way on the best available routes safely, regulating halts. Also, composing and instructing detachments, advance guards, rear guards, flankers, giving them clear orders and the means to do their jobs.
The advance guard gets special attention.
Yeah, it's crucial for information. Needs a mix of troops, light infantry and cavalry, maybe some elite units, horse artillery, engineers, pontooniers, sappers, with light bridging gear, good marksmen. Needs a topographical officer for sketching terrain. Irregular cavalry can be great for scouting. The commander and staff must form accurate ideas and report clearly. No guesswork.
Maintaining the lines of operations and establishing depots, page 209, 210, sounds like the core logistical task on the move.
It's the lifeline. As the army advances, you absolutely need secure depots for supplies, ammunition replacements, and to keep that connection back to your main base open. Jomini suggests a system. Principal depots, large town or fortress, and secondary ones closer to the front, maybe 15, 30 miles apart.
These need guarding.
Definitely. You need a dedicated brigade of depots under a prudent general officer. Troops to garrison the depots, protect convoys, manage mail, repair roads and bridges, maybe even organize local resources. The security of communications is paramount. These depot troops can sometimes function as strategic reserves too, referencing Article 23.
What about hostile populations, like Spain?
That makes it incredibly difficult. He mentions the French struggled for years, 1808-1812, against Spanish guerrillas who constantly attacked convoys and messengers. Even keeping the line to Cadiz open was a major effort. It required numerous small garrisons plus mobile columns constantly patrolling. Logistics becomes a war in itself.
Intelligence gathering also falls under this practical art.
Yes. Jomini notes it actually became harder in his time, with armies often dispersed in cantonments or bivouacs over wide areas compared to the old days of single, large, fixed camps, which were easier to reconnoiter or infiltrate with spies.
So spies are less useful.
Less useful for pinpointing every enemy unit, but still valuable, especially if you can track the movements of the enemy's commander-in-chief, particularly a great captain like Napoleon. Where he goes often reveals the main effort or project. Lacking perfect intel, a skillful general uses hypotheses deducing likely enemy moves based on terrain, bases, and strategic possibilities. Jomini claims some success doing this himself. Usually an enemy only has a few rational main lines of attack, center or one extremity, limiting the possibilities.
Signals get a brief mention.
Just noting that military instruments, bugles, drums, were used, but mainly for skirmishers or basic maneuvers. Coordinating large troop movements simultaneously was still very difficult. Shouts could inspire, but weren't reliable signals.
He gives a really stark example of bad logistics and staff work, doesn't he? Page 210, Berthier in 1809.
A classic. Berthier, Napoleon's longtime chief of staff, was excellent at transmitting orders, but sometimes lacked independent strategic judgment. Before the battles around Abensberg, he issued orders based on Napoleon's last known plan, telling Marshal Davoust to move back towards Ratisbon.
But the situation had changed.
Drastically. Davoust realized this and wisely started falling back towards Ingolstadt to concentrate with the rest of the army. But Berthier, rigidly sticking to the old order without understanding the intent or the new reality, insisted Davoust follow the literal instruction. It nearly led to Davoust's corps being isolated and destroyed.
How was it saved?
Napoleon arrived like lightning. He got an updated info via telegraph. He immediately grasped the situation, countermanded Berthier's bad orders, rapidly concentrated the scattered corps, and launched the series of attacks, Abensberg, Landshut, Eckmühl, Ratisbon, that defeated the Austrians and repaired his chief of staff's blunder. Jomini uses it to show how crucial it is for staff officers to understand the why behind orders, not just the what, and how Napoleon's genius could overcome even contemptible logistics caused by poor staff work.
Wow. Okay, so logistics is the essential machinery. Let's move to the sharp end. The formation of troops for battle, chapter 7 or 8 in the structure.
Right, the tactical level, how you arrange your troops for combat. Jomini acknowledges finding a single stable organization is difficult, but suggests a general layout of 4 parts. 2 wings, a center, and a reserve. Divisions might operate outside this main line for specific tasks or as further reserves. He details reserve composition too.
Artillery first, article Xing 3 maybe.
Its mobility had increased significantly. It should be distributed along the front, often attached to divisions, but he warns against scattering it too much. Concentrate fire where it matters.
The main rule for artillery.
Concentrate fire on the decisive point of the enemy's line, usually just before your main infantry assault, to shatter their formation and morale. Wagram in 1809, with that huge unsupported battery, was an exception driven by specific circumstances, he notes.
Infantry, article XE3. The most important arm.
Jomini certainly thought so. Forms the bulk of the army, holds ground, delivers the main attack. But crucially, it needs support from cavalry and artillery to be truly effective and achieve decisive results. It can't do it all alone.
What about infantry formations? Lines versus columns.
The eternal debate. Deployed lines, usually 2 or 3 ranks deep, offer maximum firepower, but are slow, difficult to maneuver over uneven ground, prone to wavering and disorder under fire.
Columns.
Advantages: speed, mobility, easier to handle, good for shock effect, breaking through. Disadvantages: present a deep target to artillery, less initial firepower compared to a line of the same frontage. He discusses different types: closed columns, open columns, columns at half distance.
Does he propose an ideal attack formation?
He suggests one, referenced as figure 31, a battalion formed in 2 ranks, perhaps 3 divisions, companies or platoons, deep, with a 4th division deployed out front as skirmishers. This aimed for a balance more initial firepower than a very deep column, still mobile with shock potential. He also mentions the checkered order, figure 45 battalions arranged in 2 lines with intervals like a checkerboard, good for marches, forming line quickly, and useful against cavalry as it breaks up their charge.
What about movement by flanks of companies? G20.
Useful for moving quickly through broken ground or woods, but potentially dangerous. It breaks the battalion's linear formation, requires excellent discipline, and makes the unit vulnerable if caught by cavalry. Needs scouts out, shouldn't be done near the enemy, and troops must be able to reform instantly. only for well-drilled units.
So the best way to make a serious attack, page 243.
He finds it hard to define one best way, but his suggested approach involves combining fire and shock. Perhaps advance with battalions in columns, maybe his favorite formation, doubled on the center, deploy the first line skirmishers, deliver a volley at close range, and then the second line advances through the intervals of the first to deliver the decisive charge. Or the first line delivers fire, then charges. The combination is key.
What about just advancing in deployed lines?
He doubts lines alone can decide battles purely through firefight superiority unless one side's fire is vastly better or the enemy is already shaken. His own combat experience, he says, usually involved either deployed battalions firing until one side withdrew or columns advancing to charge, causing the enemy to retire or be broken. Actual bayonet-to-bayonet melees between formed units in the open field were rare, he claims, mostly happening in confined spaces like villages or defiles.
Okay, cavalry. Article XLV. Its roles.
Wide-ranging, reconnaissance, screening the army's movements, covering flanks, launching quick raids, coup de main, pursuing a beaten enemy, acting as rear guard during retreats, and of course delivering decisive charges on the battlefield.
Charge types.
Line, columns, echelon, staggered waves. He discusses the pace. Impetuosity is good, but a fast trot is often best for maintaining order and cohesion in a line charge until the final moments. Gallop is better against artillery or infantry that seems ready to stand firm. Lance versus saber. Lance requires good order to be effective. Saber might be better in a confused melee.
Dragoons get specific mention.
As mounted infantry. Useful for quickly seizing a defile, defending terrain dismounted during a retreat, or scouting woods. But Jomini notes the difficulty of training soldiers to be equally good at both mounted and dismounted combat, a potential contradiction in their role. Ultimately, bravery matters more than the specific weapon type. He points to Turks and Circassians fighting effectively dismounted.
Cavalry formations.
He prefers the checkered order over solid, full lines for cavalry too, finding it more flexible.
And cavalry versus cavalry fights. Page 251.
Two crucial points. First, your initial charging line will almost inevitably be checked or disordered by the impact, even if successful. You need a second line or reserve ready to support or exploit. Second, victory usually goes to the side that can commit the last formed reserve, hitting the opponent's flank or disordered front. Trying to form cavalry in more than two deep lines just leads to confusion, he argues, countering another theorist, Wagner, on this.
Finally, combined arms. Article XL6.
The art of using infantry, cavalry, and artillery together, supporting each other effectively. Posting the different arms according to the terrain, the objective, and the likely enemy actions. Achieving simultaneous employment and mutual support is key to tactical success. Mastering this requires studying history and gaining practical experience.
Right. That seems to cover the main strategic and tactical framework in the core text. But then there's the supplement and a second appendix. What do they add?
The supplement was originally intended as a concluding article, unpublished at first. It was written specifically to assist the hereditary Grand Duke of Russia, who Jomini was tutoring. Its goal was to help the reader really grasp the fundamental features first, before getting lost in details, and also to add insights on acquiring that strategic intuition, the coup d'oeil.
So it recaps the science versus the art of strategy.
Exactly. Science. Knowing how to analyze the theater of war, estimate the enemy, determine the relative importance of decisive points, referencing Articles 822. Art. The skillful employment of troops, offensively or defensively, consistently applying those two fundamental principles, mass against fractions, strike in the decisive direction.
He reiterates the importance of choosing the objective.
Calls it the most important point in framing any plan, references Article 9 appointed. Then choosing the lines of operations, Article 21, usually one, sometimes two if necessary, but always conforming to the fundamental principle. Avoid double lines unless unavoidable, and if forced onto two geographical lines, concentrate the mass on the more important one.
He revisits the idea of a central position.
Notes it's most useful when enemy corps are widely separated, like in the 7 Years' War, or separated by natural barriers. But if you have great numerical inferiority, he suggests it might be wiser to maneuver on the extremities rather than risk being crushed in the center. He contrasts Carnot's half-skillful use of central position with the excellence of Napoleon's maneuvers leading to St. Bernard or Jena, which perfectly embodied the principle.
Battle maneuvers also get linked back to the core principle.
Tactical excellence comes from applying the same idea on the battlefield. Massing forces against a key point, like the enemy's wing or center, requires accurate calculation of distances, calmness under pressure, choosing good defensive-offensive positions, referencing Article XXX, ensuring simultaneous use of all arms, referencing page 159-162, and knowing how to inspire the soldiers.
Military policy and choosing leaders comes up again.
Re-emphasizing its critical nature for statesmen. Pick a general with proven qualities, strong character, energy. Ensure a good strategist is chief of staff. The nation's fate can depend on this choice, referencing Article 14 again.
And how to acquire that strategic coup d'oeil, that intuition. His advice. Study military history, focusing on the campaigns of great captains. Study geometry and topography. Pore over military maps. Visit potential theaters of war if possible. And above all, gain practical experience in war.
There's another note on river passages, page 276.
Yeah, just reinforcing there are exceptional situations where standard rules might bend. The absolute essential is keeping your bridges secure. The danger is if the enemy can mass against your bridgehead while your own forces are still divided by the river. He mentions Wagram as an example, referencing Article XE7 again.
And he finishes the supplement with that reflection on the practical man versus the theorist.
Right, a dose of realism. No book can magically grant executive ability or a penetrating mind. Theory can't instill the germ if it's not naturally there. He'd seen marshals who spouted theory but couldn't apply it. His works, he claims, are for careful, inquiring minds seeking guiding principles of valuable service to officers looking to improve.
Okay, then there's that second appendix, added even later. What drove that? It seems directly prompted by the impact of new firearms becoming apparent, particularly from the Crimean War, page 279. He saw the murderous effect of rifles and felt compelled to investigate how this might change tactics.
How does he frame it? He looks back at the French Republican tactics.
Page 280. Yes, their use of columns supported by swarms of skirmishers. He argues this wasn't just a brilliant invention, but partly born of necessity. Their troops were often poorly instructed initially, some generals weren't great tacticians, and the terrain they fought on, Vosges, Alps, Vendée, favored dispersed formations. Columns were also needed to attack fortified camps and positions.
He addresses the ongoing debates about formations.
He criticizes the tendency of theorists, clearest minds, to reduce everything to absolute, rigid systems, ignoring circumstances. He clarifies that his proposal for lines of small columns was primarily intended for attack, not as the only formation for all situations, especially defense. And he notes that great generals had approved his ideas.
He brings in Archduke Charles again from the Vienna Congress.
Apparently, Charles thanked Jomini for his summary, finding it useful. Charles told him he'd actually used columns for his less reliable landwehr troops at the Battle of Essling, Aspern-Essling, in 1809. Because the space was contracted, he felt columns were more resilient to French cavalry charges than deployed lines would have been, given the troops' quality. This reinforced Jomini's view that columns had their place, even defensively, in specific contexts.
Then he analyzes Wellington's system in Spain. This is fascinating.
Wellington was pragmatic. He knew his troops. British, dependable in line fire, but maybe less impetuous. Spanish-Portuguese allies, good as skirmishers, but perhaps less reliable in shock action. He also knew the French, their fierce impetuosity in column attacks.
So Wellington developed a counter-system.
Exactly. Choose strong defensive positions, often on reverse slopes. Screen the approaches heavily with skirmishers, using his Spanish-Portuguese riflemen, to disrupt and wear down the advancing French columns. Place artillery effectively. Keep the main British infantry line sheltered behind the crest, hidden from view and direct fire until the last moment.
And then,
when the French columns arrived at the summit, tired, disordered, already thinned by skirmishers and artillery, then the hidden British infantry would stand up, deliver a devastating close-range volley, and often follow with a controlled bayonet charge. Jomini lists several battles where this proved highly effective.
Then he tackles the big one, Waterloo. What's his analysis of the French loss?
He attributes it to several factors. The terrible muddy ground hindering French movements, the French using overly deep, dense columns, especially on their right wing, a lack of coordination and simultaneity between infantry and cavalry attacks. They didn't always hit together for maximum impact. And absolutely critically, the arrival of Blücher's entire Prussian army on Napoleon's flank and rear.
Does he think Waterloo proves lines are inherently superior to columns?
No, he explicitly argues against that interpretation. He believes if the main French cavalry charge, Ney's charge, had been immediately supported by a coordinated infantry assault en masse, they might have broken the battered Allied squares, Prussians notwithstanding.
And without the Prussians.
Jomini is convinced the Anglo-Allied army under Wellington would have had to retreat if Blücher hadn't arrived. So for him, Waterloo doesn't invalidate the potential power of well-directed columns. It demonstrates the importance of terrain, combined arms coordination, and the decisive impact of a massive flank attack by a fresh army.
So looking forward, how did he see tactics evolving with these new, more lethal firearms?
He asks, will battles just become long-range rifle duels? His answer is no. Maneuver will still be necessary. You'll still need to concentrate fire on key points, maneuver to outflank the enemy, use columns, perhaps shallower ones, to break through weakened points, and employ infantry, cavalry, and artillery in concert.
So firearms enhance tactics, but don't replace the core principles.
That's his view. Skirmishers become more important, fire becomes more deadly, but the fundamental need to maneuver, concentrate force, and use combined arms remains. He mentions German generals were already experimenting with modified column systems, breaking battalions into more, smaller, shallower columns, easier to deploy. The application of principles will change, he predicts, but the maxims themselves likely won't.
Finally, there's a section sketching principal maritime expeditions.
Right, a brief appendix acknowledging how maritime power changes strategic possibilities.
What examples does he touch on?
A quick tour through history. Ancient Greeks versus Troy, the massive Persian invasions involving huge fleets, Xerxes, Alexander coordinating his land army with a coastal fleet, the Punic Wars between naval powers Rome and Carthage.
Vikings and Normans.
Yeah, Oleg attacking Constantinople with boats down the Dnieper, Danes raiding France and Britain, and William the Conqueror's 1066 invasion highlighting the complexity with two simultaneous related expeditions, Norwegians landing first, then William.
Crusades and Ottomans.
Crusades mentioned as partly land-sea efforts, Ottomans crossing the Dardanelles, Muhammad II using a fleet, even transported overland, to take Constantinople, later naval attacks on Rhodes, Otranto, Negropont, the incredibly long and brutal siege of Candia, Crete, against the Venetians, 1648-1669, gets detailed mention for its ferocity, mining, countermining, and eventual Venetian withdrawal after huge losses on both sides.
And more modern French efforts.
The large but ultimately unsuccessful Franco-Spanish fleet attempting to cover a planned invasion of England during the American Revolutionary War, 1779, and the recent, for Jomini 1862, joint expedition to Mexico, where the initial capture of Veracruz was easy due to lack of resistance, but the future was uncertain.
Wow, okay, that's an immense amount of detail. We've covered Jomini's background, his attempt to create a science of war, the crucial link he saw between politics and military action.
His definition of strategy, that absolute core principle of applying mass against the decisive point, the importance of bases, lines of operation, interior lines.
We looked at how terrain like mountains, or factors like fortifications, influence strategy, then the mixed operations like river crossings and retreats.
And the practicalities, logistics, staff work, intelligence gathering, plus the tactical level, formations for infantry, cavalry, artillery, combined arms.
And finally, how he grappled with the impact of new technology while trying to hold on to what he saw as timeless principles, and even that overview of maritime power.
It's really quite staggering how he tried to systematize it all, drawing heavily on the Napoleonic era but aiming for universal rules. He provides a whole vocabulary, a framework for analyzing military problems.
Absolutely. Even if the technology of war has changed almost beyond recognition, that effort to find structure, to identify key elements like concentration, objective, logistics, it's still influential.
It gives you categories, ways to think about conflict even today. The core challenges of coordinating force, securing supply, understanding the political context, those haven't entirely disappeared.
Indeed. Well, thank you for providing these sources and walking us through this incredibly detailed deep dive.
My pleasure. It's dense stuff, but fascinating. And for you, the listener, perhaps a final thought to consider, building on what we've discussed. Jomini was convinced his fundamental strategic principles, things like mass, decisive point, lines of communication, would endure despite technological change like better firearms.
Right.
So thinking about our current era with cyber warfare, drone swarms, artificial intelligence, information operations becoming central to conflict, how might Jomini's core ideas manifest? Can you apply mass in cyberspace? What's a decisive point in an information campaign? How do concepts like interior lines or logistics translate when conflict becomes less physical and more digital or networked? Something to think about. How much do those old principles still hold, and how might they need to be radically adapted for the future of warfare?